Let's make some let's make some noise. We're live. It's 5:44, 5:45, and I'm here early for the 7 o'clock show, late for a afternoon show, I guess. But tonight I want to talk about blow through carbureted applications for everything. Big block, small block, LS. It doesn't matter what it is. If it is an internal combustion engine and it has some sort of carburetor on it and you're blowing through it, that's what I want to talk about. More specifically, the need for an intercooler, because we've run the video recently on running the intercooler on the LS with the M90 supercharger, and then we went through all sorts of different types of data. People, are not arguing, discussing their their math and the temperature drops and all kinds of things. And so it got me thinking, well, what happens with blow through carb applications? And I've run lots and lots of tests, as you might imagine. I have stuff videos up on the channel where we've run blow through stuff with without intercoolers, blow through stuff with intercoolers. We've run different kinds of fuel. We've run EFI ones with and without intercoolers and all that. So there's actually quite a bit to talk about, and it's not ever as cut and dry as a lot of people that make comments would have you believe, because we know that the world is not a black and white world. The performance world is definitely not not an exact science here. So there are sometimes yes and sometimes no. The answer usually is that it depends. So we need to talk about specifically what we're doing, but people don't want to hear that. They want to hear it's always better with a rec port head, or it's always better with a cathedral port head, or it's always better with a single pattern cam or a dual pattern cam. And very rarely is that ever the case, or very rarely is that always the case. So let's talk about blow through application. So blow through application, and the thumbnail that I have up is a photo actually of a Torque Storm supercharger. Could be anything, Vortec, Pro Charger, whatever. Could be on any motor. This one's on a small block Chevy. Doesn't matter what motor that you put it on. A little harder to do a blow through application like this with a positive displacement supercharger. That's not something you see very often. You'd have to remote mount the positive displacement supercharger. So like a little Eaton or whatever, you could remote mount a 671. A lot of times the guys do it for Bonneville, mounted in front of the blower, the Potvin ones, mounted in front of the engine just to get it low so that you can get low hood and get aero and stuff, and then mounted in front. And then they spin it and have the discharge go into the motor. And that works. You could actually do that and blow into a carburetor. Normally they do it with a lot of times with some sort of mechanical fuel injection, and that works. And they do it with a low profile. And I know we're going off on a tangent on a low profile short runner intake manifold, which is typical of blower manifolds. So all that's possible. I don't remember seeing that positive displacement blower blowing into a blow through carbureted application. Normally you see these with the one like that I have the photo up with some sort of centrifugal blower. Turbos are obviously very common also. That happens a lot with a blow through. But at any rate, the benefit to this for people that don't know and don't understand this, that if you guys are watching the video, when we're running fuel injection, especially port fuel injection like we normally do, where the injector is down somewhere near the base of the intersection of the intake manifold and the cylinder head. Sometimes they're in the cylinder head, sometimes they're in the intake manifold, but down in that intersection, spraying down kind of toward or on the back of the valve. What we have there is we're spraying fuel there, and we're getting boost from some type of supercharger, and then we're spraying fuel there. The problem is, or the lack of benefit is, that when you spray the fuel there, you don't get good charge cooling. You don't have enough time for the charge cooling to actually take place. A lot of people don't understand that because they don't really understand how fast this is happening. So if you're running, 100 or a few hundred times a second, how much cooling do you think really takes place? So that distance that the air and fuel have to travel is very, very short. Getting into the combustion chamber, it's basically on its way in anyway. And so there's not a lot of time for charge cooling. There's some, but not as much. Not as much as there is if you introduce the fuel farther away from the valve. So you could do that, for instance, at the top of a stack on some sort of stacked fuel injection like the old Crowers or or Hillborns or any of those. You could do it on the front of a long runner manifold. You could do it in front of the throttle body if you wanted to get it that far away. All of those things are beneficial. One way to do it, and the thing that we're talking about tonight, is if you introduce the fuel from a carburetor. And this also works, by the way, we're not separating these two, at least for this discussion. This also works for any of the throttle body fuel injections that go on top of an intake manifold. Typically, it's some sort of carbureted style, dual plane or single plane kind of intake manifold. So even a 4-hole throttle body that has injectors in it that inject fuel into it, or single injectors like the old GM stuff. If you're injecting fuel there into the intake manifold, you're getting more charge cooling. That's why we see when we do the comparison tests with carburation versus port fuel injection, we get more power from the carburation normally if we run the same manifold. So there's more time for charge cooling to actually take place. And if you've ever measured the temperature underneath the carburetor when you're running a carburetor, it's not unusual to see condensation there. And the manifold after a wide open throttle run is very, very cold to the touch because it changes the temperature. And so there you have lots of cold air and fuel going through there, and it helps cool everything off. So, and there's time for that to happen also, which is also good. So the benefit to that when we're running forced induction is we have hot air, because whenever you build pressure, the compression produces heat, and then heat is a byproduct of that. And then we're having more air, but hotter air going in, forcing that into our motor more than it could ingest of its own accord. And then we see that as pressure. The problem is we get heat, but the nice thing about blowing all of that through the carburetor is that we get charge cooling. We essentially get intercooling from blowing through a carburetor and or these 4-hole fuel injected deals in the intake manifold. And we get more doing that than we do just having the fuel injection happen down near the valve. So there is intercooling in a sense going on a blow through application, whether it's a carburetor or that type of fuel injection that we discussed, the 4-hole stuff. There is intercooling going on. So that's actually not the question. The question isn't, does intercooling happen with that versus having an intercooler? Yes. Do you need an intercooler when you have a blow through application? Now it's not a universal thing. I universally recommend intercoolers for forced induction applications. If you have a forced induction application, I recommend you put an intercooler on. Is it mandatory is a different question than if somebody asks me, Richard, do I have to have one or should I have one? Those are different questions. Yeah, you should. If you have forced induction, you should have an intercooler, because not only is it going to help you, but it's also going to give you, like we talk about with static compression for tuning windows. If you're running 9-to-1 instead of 10-to-1 or 11 or 12-to-1, it will make more power the other way. But your tuning window goes, okay, it's got to be spot on if it's really high compression. Same thing with a turbo or a blower application, non-intercooled. You narrow the tuning window down, and also the intercooler helps make the thing make the same kind of power in more circumstances. So it's much more forgiving of hotter days and all that stuff. So it's better all the way around. So if you are going to run boost, you should run an intercooler. Now let's address the question, do I have to run an intercooler? No, you don't. I drove around for years and years and years, 85,000 miles worth on my 5-liter Mustang with a Vortex supercharger. It worked fantastic. I can say nothing but good things about my experience with that car and with that blower, and all that worked out great. I made sure that we had cold air going to the blower. We had a dedicated cold air source for our mass air meter because we were just running EEC4s, and we had run the FMU for a long time, but eventually went to a Pro-M meter, a calibrated meter, and bigger injectors, and then had the meter into a housing that my buddy Bernie, shout out to Bernie Van Hammond, made in the fender well. So we made sure that we had cold air going to it, and we were only running 7 or 8 pounds. And I ran a Silver State like that, was running flat out with a wide open throttle for much longer than 99.9% of other people that do this would ever do, because you're flat out for 35 minutes straight at wide open throttle. Not very many people do that. So, and that worked out fine and was non-intercooled, and it was a little bit lower than factory compression with it. And we did have good gas in it. We had 135 degree charge temperature, just sustained basically going in because we had cold air coming in. That's how much added temperature we had. It was non-intercooled, and it all worked out. It would be better with an intercooler, but it would also be lower if we were blowing through fuel like a carburetor. And so that's the thing. The ideal setup is an intercooler. And if you have a blow-through application like a carburetor or that fuel injection, you're blowing through that, an intercooler and some sort of high-octane gas and or E85 or methanol. That's the ideal thing. That's all the safety stuff. So now the question becomes, is as we dissect this, what can I get away with? Well, you can get away with running on the far end of the other end of the spectrum is non-intercooled, no blow-through, low octane gas, and you're going to have to take all the timing out of it. And then you also have hot air going to it. All of that would be basically bad. So in between all of those are all the areas that people want to argue about and are all the areas that people want to run. So the first thing I always recommend is start out with a cold air intake, regardless of what you're doing. Make sure you're getting cold air to no matter what combination you're doing, you're going to be much, much happier. Grabbing engine compartment heat is a terrible idea because it might be 100 degrees hotter and you have just basically negated all the benefits of any sort of charge cooling that you were going to get from your combination, from your intercooler, from your blow through application, you're cooling from the carburetor and or fuel or whatever it is. You're going to negate all that just by grabbing air from under the hood. That's not a good idea. So don't do that. Make sure you get cold air. The next thing is, now where does a blow through carbureted application come into a carburetor and or blow through, fuel injection with no intercooler? That works well too. In fact, I would say that a blow through is not far down from it's down from having a blow through, and this is what people want to know. It's down from having a blow through and an intercooler and good gas like E85 or methanol or something like that. It's not as, it won't make as much power. It won't be as safe as that. The question people want to know is, is a blow through application with no intercooler, does that work as well as like a port EFI non-blow through carbureted thing with an intercooler? And the question is, I really don't know. I haven't specifically done that test, and I don't think I could do that test the way that people would want it done, because the way that they would want it done would be, hey, can you do this and get the most amount of power, which would mean knock sensor technology. We'd have to just run it to the limit of detonation for whatever that combination is. It's a combination of, what NA timing it ran best at, what is the detonation threshold of this, what is the chamber shape, all those things are going to come into play. Which one of those could I ultimately make more power at? I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, I have an idea, but having not tested it specifically, I'm not going to give you just a speculation. You can make either one of those work. There would be other questions for both those combinations. On port injection, one of the things you can do that you can't do with some sort of central fuel supply, carburetor or a 4-hole throttle body, is you could tune individual cylinders, which is beneficial. And if you're running E85 or methanol and you're running port injection, and an intercooler, you're doing pretty well. But if you're doing a blow through, obviously we've shown videos where we're trying to get the air-fuel distribution to be even. That would be important because otherwise you got to tune to whatever the leanest cylinder is. That could be problematic. But in terms of charge cooling, you're getting a lot of charge cooling by blowing through a carburetor or one of these 4-hole throttle bodies. It's not unusual for that type of application to knock out between 100 and 150 degrees of charge temperature, depending on what the starting temperature is going in. The more that you have going in, the more that you can knock out. There's obviously a limit of that. But the other thing to consider here is, let's say that you're running a blow-through application and you're running it on gas. Even regular gasoline, 91 octane pump gas or whatever, or even some kind of race gas, 100 or 110 or 12 or whatever, you're going to get charge cooling associated with running that boosted air through the carburetor or the fuel injection, and then you're going to get the atomization, and that's going to take heat out. And like I said, in all my testing of blow-through stuff, 100 degrees knocking out 100 degrees is not a problem at all. It's that's more the norm for any sort of realistic kind of charge temperature. If you have a charge temperature that's above 200 degrees or even not quite 200 degrees, it's not hard to knock 100 out of that with a blow through application. You can get even better than that if you were to run, let's say you're running a blow through E85 carburetor, or your injectors in your 4-hole throttle body are also big enough to supply E85 to that. Now you're talking about injecting E85. And so you have charge cooling associated with E85, which is going to be even better than the gasoline is. So you'll have even more charge cooling, not to mention the fact that if you have E85 and an E85 carburetor, or the 4-hole throttle body injector size is big enough to allow you to run E85, and you're running E85, you have more charge cooling, plus you have more octane and you have more cooling to begin with. So that you're much better off in that scenario, and you're going to be able to make a lot of power. I kind of would like to see it. I'd actually like to ask Kevin, what some of his real high horsepower things. I've seen stuff that's 2,000 horsepower for blow through carbureted stuff with like Vortex and things on them. I've seen stuff that's in that range, and so we know that that's possible. And the ones that I saw were not intercooled; they were just blow through, with carburetors on them. And this particular one was done by Miller, and I think that was actually a blow through Dominator. So they were making, plenty of power there. And the boost was, reasonably high. They had a good NA power output to start out with, but it was making pretty good boost. Their problem, actually, because it was in a boat, was not that they lacked power. In fact, that they probably had too much. They kind of had to detune it for what they were trying to get done. But it worked out really well. So you can, in our hierarchy of stuff, it's blow through plus intercooler plus E85 or methanol or whatever, and then all the way down on the base of our hierarchy pyramid is 87 octane and no intercooler and hot air induction and all that stuff. And then where you are there is, okay, how many steps have you taken up to make things better for you? Do you have cold air induction? Do you have an intercooler? Do you have a blow through? Do you have E85? What are all these things that you have that make it better, and you get closer to being optimum? And by optimum, I don't just mean maximum power, but optimum meaning, yes, also safe, because that's, let's face it, that's a critical thing. We can make lots of power if our intention was just to get a hero number and then blow it up. It's a lot easier to get a big number like that, but to get it to work, which is what the guys like Morris and Nelson and those guys do. So it's very important. Like I said, I always recommend intercoolers, but in these applications with the blow through stuff, a lot of times they're not necessary. Like I said, I ran an intercooler or a non-intercooled deal on my Vortex for a long time, years and years and years like that. And it worked fine. And I ran it a lot of times just on regular 87. I didn't race it around like that, but it could drive around like that, because we know that the normal Mustang engine, which is the way that I drove it, NA, that it worked fine. So you can do that. And on a blow through application, mine was just fuel injection, port fuel injection. On a blow through application, you're definitely going to have charge cooling. So the requirement for an intercooler would be at a fairly, a much higher boost level than it would be on, or at least my recommendation for that would be at a much higher boost level than it would be on your normal, just port injected kind of fuel injected thing. You have a carburetor, you got intercooling basically already. So until you're getting to fairly high power levels, and as we talked about with the thing that I wanted to ask Kevin about to get some more information on how far these guys are pushing these things, it might be that, and I know guys running methanol don't even run intercoolers normally on some of the race applications, because their consideration is for weight versus the power gain that they get, because I know they get a power gain, but it also costs weight, so that's acceleration, and so they have to balance that as well. So I think you get away with a lot on a blow through application and not have to worry about it. Then this is when other things start to worry me on these applications where you're blowing through a carburetor or the 4-hole throttle body, is mostly the intake design. It's not the fuel delivery. The fuel delivery, as long as in a carburetor, especially blow-through carburetors, seem to work pretty well, and they seem to be very consistent. So when we've run them, if we make a run and then we make another run, they're the same. And so that's what we want. That way, if we make a change to it and we make another run, we know that the change that we're seeing is from the change that we made. And so we see a change in air fuel and hopefully a change in power or whichever direction we're going, making it safer, whatever we're doing. That's very important. But you can get away with a lot more boost and stuff on a street application if you're running a carburetor than if you're not running blow through. But the concern is on these carbureted intake manifolds, dual planes and single planes, you start to get concerned with air fuel distribution, because you're carrying the air through the manifold. Does the same amount of air fuel get to all of the cylinders? And again, that's not something that a lot of times people discuss about, the need for an intercooler or blow through or that, but you need to think about stuff like that, because if that's a limiting factor, if you have, 8 holes that are, in the 11s and one of them is in the 13s, because of distribution, not because of the fuel supply, whether it's a carburetor or the 4-hole throttle body, but because of the manifold design, that's the one that's going to blow up. And it doesn't matter that you got charge cooling, because it's too lean, because it's going to hurt itself just from being too lean. So, like I said, all sorts of different considerations, and people need to look at that stuff. But in terms of, for the guys out there that are the absolute guys, because you have a blow-through application doesn't mean that you don't have to have an intercooler, or that you shouldn't have an intercooler, because it will be beneficial. But you don't have to, I guess, is the whole thing. Let's see what you guys got going on. I do like intercooling. I do like blow-through stuff, and I like the combination best. But you don't always have to run that. Cool topic. Which blow-through carbs are you most comfortable with? The two that I've run that are dedicated blow-through carbs are CSU and Quick Fuel, and both of them worked. We have run other non-specific blow-through carburetors, because they were enclosed in the enclosures that Paxton and Vortex sell. And those were Quick Fuels, I think, back in the day. I think we've also done them with Hollies. And that worked well, provided in the way that they have it set up, you do. But provided you have more fuel pressure going in than you have, boost, and then you get enough fuel flow. And all that seems to work out. Then it's just kind of normal tuning. Kevin, happy to report I have my AMR 300 spinning under power of the 450cc Predator. Boosty noises confirmed. I like to hear that. That's awesome. More cooler, more better. Exactly. It's always better with boost. It is. Data is especially important. Cooler and short distance, I would think better. Not short distance. You actually want more distance for more cooling. More power, droplet size. Yeah. Atomization is important. So droplet size, smaller droplet size is usually better. I've had a blow through Paxton on my Demon for Mr. Norm. Nice. I've had a pressurized box over the carb. I wish I had it along with my 67 Barracuda Fastback. So it had a bonnet on top of the carburetor, or a box enclosing the whole carburetor. Which one of those? Joseph, I love the channel. Thank you very much. Have you ever looked into doing some VW TDI testing? No, I won't do any diesel testing on this channel. I myself have been there when the guys have done some of that stuff, because Eric from West Tech is really big on the TDI VWs, and I think that they're cool. And I love the stuff that he did with he's had a couple of them, and love the stuff that he did on those, getting more fuel to it and turning the boost up and stuff. That was all great stuff, but we probably won't do that on this channel. I won't ever run a diesel engine on the engine dyno, that's for sure. Your progress on any of my projects? Blue collar, record rainfall in Florida yesterday. That's not good. We had rain here today too. Hello, Bruno. What are you doing, huh? You look like you just woke up. What time is it? Oh, it's 6, huh? It's time for dinner, huh? Well, after my thing, we can have dinner, okay? Did you hear about Florida issued a shoot-on-site mandate for crocodiles? I believe there's a small breeding population there. I thought Florida had crocodiles and alligators. Had some great conversations with Turbo 4.6 Mach 1 owner and a Whipple 5.4 GT500. So we're saying as a cooler that causes the air to slow down will work better. I don't think you want to slow it down. That sounds like a euphemism for restriction. Roots blown, intercooled below the blower and above the intake. Can you run those intercoolers? Yeah, Freiberger did an air to water intercooler between the blower and a tunnel ram on a big block, which was cool. I still preach intercooling even when using M1. It doesn't weigh much, but the added power and weight is versus weight is worth the weight. Yeah, I agree. I'm an all intercooler all the time guy. But a guy running, if a guy asks me if he can take a small block Ford and run a blower on it, a blow through carburetor at 6 or 8 pounds without an intercooler, blowing through a carburetor, yeah, you certainly can do that. Intercoolers are always optional, but not using intercoolers like optioning an auto in a car. You have to plan to track. Why would you? Oh, you mean not having a manual trans? Remember to hit the like button. I don't have a poll up yet. I should though, right? Okay, here's our poll. Excuse me, would you run an intercooler with an E85 carbureted big block at 7 pounds? Let's see. Let's see what peeps have to say. Let's see. Hit the like button. Water meth injection. Yeah, I have lots of videos up on that. Draw through cools a supercharger. Yeah, like with a 671 or 871, those kinds of blowers, hard to do a blow through on that. But yeah, the draw through thing for the blowers is really good because it cools the air off a lot. And especially if you run E85 carburetors on it, which they did on, which Freiberger did on that big block. Drag racing, road racing, endurance, and street use going to have different situations and needs. Going to get opinions and arguments. Yeah. Poll should have been, have you ever run boost without an intercooler? Ran a blower through a small block Chevy at 8.5 to 1 compression on 8 psi on premium fuel, no problem. Yep. Water meth, just methanol is kind of Band-Aid. It works rather have an intercooler. Yeah, I've shown that comparison a few times, and the intercooler always kind of comes out ahead. In my opinion, if you're under 8 pounds on E85 or methanol, you don't need to worry about intercooling. It's all about the packaging. Water meth is there when there's no room. Yeah, sometimes you can't package the intercooler. That's another consideration. Big Red still runs blow through. That's right. I know Eric was responsible for a lot of the tuning on that. I have a document on diesel timing that shows cylinder temp and pressure at various compression ratios. It's pretty amazing how much heat is added during compression stroke, even at 9 to 12 to 1. Been running a ProCharger F2 on a 540 since 2005, non-intercooled C16. Want to water air intercooler this winter. So we'll see what gains with the cooler and more timing. Yeah, Turbo Boy, if you take a look, I have a video that I did. We were doing a blow-through carbureted deal on a big block. It was a junkyard Gen 6 with, I think I put Rodex heads on it and then some kind of small camshaft. And then we ran it with a Vortec on it at fairly high boost, and then ran it with an air-to-water intercooler, and obviously picked up a pretty good bit of power with the intercooler. John, all of that is good. There's nothing but good things about a Pinot with a LS7 on nitrous. That's just all the goodness, all the Pinot-y goodness. And as a side note, you don't happen to have the 2-liter motor that came out of the Pinot, do you? How about draw through testing the M90? That's planned actually. Making an adapter to go into the flange on the M90. Puppet Master, what's up? Kyle, I know it's hard to explain it to folks who have never done back-to-back testing intercools. Tested intercooled versus non-intercooled. Even with a blow-through, we can reduce charge temperatures 100 to 200 degrees before the carburetor. Yeah, you can. That's certainly true, depending on how much pressure you're trying to run. If your charge temperature going in is to remove 200, it'd have to be at 300 probably, or somewhere near there. So you'd have to have fairly high boost for that, but that's certainly possible. Ice water intercoolers are most popular here in Illinois. Burns. Points for that. Exhaust temp sensors on each cylinder. No, we don't normally. If I want to measure what's going on in each cylinder, we run oxygen sensors in each one of the cylinders. Are fuel distribution concerns go out the window when you have a backlog of air and fuel in the intake manifold under boost measurement? Why would distribution? You think that would cure distribution issues? Burns, you been messing with your inner chiller? Let's see. Richard, have you ever done liquid propane force induction or plan in the future? I haven't. I haven't ever run one on the dyno. The gentleman that's close by here that has the one in his AMC said that I could borrow some of his stuff, but I don't think that he had big enough mixers for me to run force induction on like some kind of LS thing. It'd have to be something that was smaller, I think. Is it possible to make more power with direct injection because you can inject the fuel at a point where you won't experience knock under extreme pressure because the fuel isn't there? Yeah, that's one consideration. I think I think even more of the consideration on direct injection is that normally what they do is elevate the static compression when they do that stuff. But also think about this is that you're directing the fuel into the cylinder, into the combustion chamber. So it's not flowing through the port. So you haven't displaced any of the airflow. So your cylinder head that flows 300 CFM on a direct injected motor is flowing more air than it does on a port injected motor because part of that is fuel. So now you can get more airflow into the motor. And with direct injection, if you have big enough injection and enough pressure and stuff, you can get the fuel that you need. So you could theoretically make more power. Can you test the new small block Chevy roller cam made by Summit Racing that has the LS firing order? A firing order change doesn't do anything. It doesn't change power. We have tested that before. Function aside, I like the look of an intercooler. Yeah, it is. It does add something. My mega truck build will be intercooled and 7 to 10 max on 85. The engine enclosed completely, so more heat control anyway. I'll take. Yeah, that's a good idea. And the other thing to think about is like if you're talking about applications like when I ran the Silver State, it would have been a really good idea to have an intercooler on that. But it also would have been a good idea, and I did have cold air going to it. But for things like running flat out like that, or in a boat, guys run stuff wide open throttle in boats for minutes at a time, and sometimes a lot longer than that. So if you're at wide open throttle for a sustained period of time, you need to have that safety margin in there. And that's why. And the nice thing about a boat is usually you have an unlimited supply of, of cold water. So air to water intercooling is really a good idea. Sticks. Yeah, I don't know what's going on with the pole. Seems like since YouTube updated the format. Hey. Hey, no. We're not chewing on that. Dogs chewing on stuff. Puppies being puppies. Yeah, we don't do that, right? I don't think he understands me. Swallow Ford here, blow through turbo, Holly bonnet, 10 psi, non-air cooled, motor's happy, good. Injecting fuel at TDC wouldn't work on gas engine because it wouldn't have enough time to inject. Bottom dead center, vaporize. Would love for you to do tests with and without intercooler NA to see how more restriction there is through the air to air and air to water, and then an interchiller to sub ambient. Be curious to see horsepower gains and losses. You have to try to figure out a way to have the intercooler core. First of all, whatever the transfer medium is, if you have an air to air intercooler and you have ambient air going into it and ambient air trying to cool it, you're not going to get anything. You're just going to get a restriction from the core. So whatever you're cooling it with has to be colder than the air that you're drawing into it. So if you have ambient air and you have ice water going through the core and you can cool the ambient air below ambient, then you could potentially get gains from it. But only if you don't have a restriction with your intercooler on the naturally aspirated motor. That's going to be hard to do. What I've explained many times is I've seen guys use this very successfully at Bonneville, where you have a constant source of very high pressure, very fast air, because if these cars are going 150 to 250 or more miles an hour, you can actually pressurize the front of a sealed opening of the air going into the motor. So essentially you're pressurizing the intercooler to flow through the intercooler, so you have more air than the motor can take. You build up a little bit of pressure. The intercooler on the NA motor is no longer a restriction, but you're cooling the air. And this is very important out at Bonneville for some days when it could be 90 or 100 degrees. And so if you can run ice water that's 30 degrees or something, and then you're cooling the air down to 60 or 70, you can get gains like that. But the key is to not have a restriction. Basic single turbo, 331, 8.5 to 1 blow through. Which should I choose? I have both, Victor Jr. or RPM air gap, looking for best fuel distribution. I don't know about fuel distribution, having not tested those two on a small block Ford. On a 331, so I'm sure that that's an 8.2 deck. small block forward. I don't know about the distribution on both those manifolds. I would say my first choice would be to pick an RPM air gap. I don't know what the rest of the motor is and what RPM you want to run and where you want to make power, but I'd be more inclined to pick the intake manifold that's going to work with the other things that I have, like the camshaft and the cylinder heads and the RPM range that you're going to run. Pick it based on that, and then you're just going to have to work on the airfield distribution. Oh, it's a small block Chevy. And I take that back. It's not a small block Ford. I haven't done testing on a small block Chevy. I've done single plane versus dual plane airfield distribution on LS motors, I think, but I don't remember doing it on a small block Chevy. So I told him I was getting 32 to 45 degree temps and wasn't impressed. So I guess he said if I upgrade the hoses, I can run a ton of pressure and get it much cooler. So hoses are on the way. We'll see. Are you talking about a drop of 32 to 45 degrees? Or you're getting it down to 32 degrees? Because that'd be really cold. My thought is there's no way a blow-through has enough time for heat, charge, temp, mass air conversion to happen versus a proper intercooler. Are you, Kyle, you're not suggesting that there's not cooling going on a blow-through application? On a carburetor on top of a carbureted dual plane manifold, that there's not cooling happening? Because there most certainly is. With the draw through carb on my single turbo lawnmower, I like it. Idle quality is terrible. It doesn't surprise me. When cylinder loads up with fuel at idle, thus at low air speed, splitting the fuel doesn't seem that best. 327's like RPM, so I'd use the air gap unless you're going to spin it up really high. I haven't tried the chili bomb yet. I haven't had a good application to try that on yet. I had someone tell me that running my stock Cadillac 500, that I can run a blow-through turbo as long as I run with intercooler. If you're running 6 or 7 pounds, you probably could run it on good gas, on pump gas, or on 91 or 93. You could get away with doing that without an intercooler, but an intercooler would be even more beneficial. And I don't need to change ring gap. Well, I would change the ring gap. Do you even know what the ring gap is? The nice thing that I could say about a Cadillac motor is I think that the cylinders wear on those if it has a lot of miles on it. Where's the endurance and hill climb people? Talk about the heat. But it's actually run hard, but they get constant water supply for cooling. That's right. The really bad thing for cooling burns is a streamliner. Those are awful for packaging. Didn't think intercooler would impact the need to change a ring gap. Well, what they're talking about is they're thinking that the intercooler is going to somehow impact ring temperature. For the poll, click out of the chat, read the video title, then click on the chat. I voted, then it gave me a percentage and the question afterwards. Everybody who wants a turbo is K24A3 and is RSX. Other than ring gap and plug gap, anything else I should do to help longevity? Normally we do ARP head studs and gaskets on that, but it probably has an MLS gasket on it already. Let's see. $8 to 10 pounds, 280 to 300 horsepower. just enough to wake it up. Carb icing, you can actually get the carburetor cold enough, you can get it below zero and it can ice over. I'd argue that a blow-through carb setup without an intercooler on E85 cools the air charge better than an EFI setup with an intercooler. Yeah, well, I know, but saying something and then having the data to support that would be different things. So if you can show me where a blow-through E85 carbureted deal has a lower charge temperature than the than the intercooler does, I would be interested in seeing that. Bill, who is that directed to? I don't like talking about wheel horsepower. All your calculations to be based on crank horsepower. The air gap is a really good intake manifold, and not just on a 327, but on any small block. But again, as we talked about with runner length and the single plane, dual plane thing fits right in line with that, that you need to decide what intake you want for the RPM range that you're planning on running on the motor. And I've experienced carburetor icing once before in the past, running a Pontiac GTO on my 455 and a 63 Grand Prix, driving home 20 miles in freezing fog in December. Carburetor stuck. It got that cold. That's when you don't want a cold air induction. You want hot air induction, right? I'm curious why somebody here is recommending that on the Honda engine that you change to a heavier oil, and I'm curious why you would run a heavier oil. Richard, what did you test the AMR on? I had an LS motor that we used to spin the AMR, and then we also had a blower dyno that we tested the AMR. But I haven't run one on a motor yet for power. All we did was spin them and airflow test them. I have two Chevy Cruise turbos, twin turbo motor with a dual draw through to provide more equal fueling to the V-twin. Also X pipe before the turbos or Y pipe after the turbos. I don't know. This is a whole new territory for turbocharged lawnmower engines. M90, the RB, that's pretty low on the list, but lots of other stuff for that. Center tri-power car, butterfly stuck open, partial from ice, exhaust crossover was blocked off. Yeah. I got this helicopter oil cooling thing that turns a shaft with airspeed. Pondering attaching boost side of a turbo to it and tucking it out like a jet engine. So it gets better as the speed of the vehicle gets better. Is there a rule of thumb for selecting a wastegate? Yeah, just put a big one in that fits. 22R Toyota truck that I want to fit a blow-through turbo and air-to-water intercooler. Injected intakes are fairly expensive here. There's no 4-barrel manifolds available. Should I use a 350? Yeah, can you fit a 2-barrel Poly 350 or a 500? You're not going to make enough power to need a 500. Richard, I found a place in Germany that sells them for V4s. What were we talking about here? That's hot mess. Are you talking about the guys that sell a kit for that? What's your opinion on keeping or deleting knock sensors on a LS? I can tell you from my experience, I don't ever run them on the engine dyno. We've never run on an LS motor that I can remember. We never run knock sensors on one. I have them in my truck because my truck's all stock, and the factory computer uses them. When you start making modifications, if you change the rockers and headers and things and camshafts and timing chains, and the motor now sounds differently, you might get false knock. I don't know if that's what the tuners are talking about. We're not worried about it because we know how much we sneak up on it too, but we know how much timing to run. We know what the air fuel needs to be, and we know how to make it be that before we, start really laying into it and making lots of power and break things. But on a factory application, mine still has the knock sensors on it. Old quadrijet carbs were underrated. According to Lake Speed Jr., his theory is that when you add cylinder pressures, it's better to have thicker oil to give the bearing a little more cushion than the factory called for. Okay. I like Lake. Lake is an awesome guy to hang around with. Can fit a Holly 2-barrel and only aiming for 7 psi. Yeah, I don't think you're at the flow rate of that carburetor and the power potential of that carburetor is beyond what you're going to do with that turbo Toyota. Yeah, Burns. I wouldn't do that. I might do that on an old small block Chevy, but I don't think I would do it on a Honda. The AMR found a place in Germany. Supposed to. There are lots of guys using them. There's lots of kits available for VWs and other stuff. So, but we're I should be testing one for too long. On the old VTEC, we did a +5 weight to get the VTEC to kick in a few hundred RPM. Why would the oil viscosity change the activation of the VTEC solenoid? The MR500 supercharger is a small roots unit with 500 cc displacement. It's the heart of the V4 Moab AMR 500 kit for a small bump in power on 4-cylinder engines such as the BMW. No, I've read exactly what we're talking about. I saw it a long time ago when we were doing all the stuff on the AMR 500. But I don't know. Are you just bringing that up because you think that it's cool or whatever? The VTEC is controlled by oil pressure, correct? It's controlled by a switching solenoid that allows pressure or doesn't allow pressure to go to a certain place. Clearances are super tight on the K series, not like the B, D, and H. Yeah, Nicholas, I don't think that the knock sensors are going to be a problem. Yeah, it's this 8V. It is electronically actuated. It's a VTEC solenoid. All it is an opening and closing thing that directs oil to the to the little sliders for the VTEC. It locks it onto the big cam. Bah, bah. Knock sensor relocation. I'd be interested to see. That would be the interesting knock sensor test. That if we ran the knock sensors like on a Gen 3 on an LS, ran them in the valley, and then moved them outside to where they have them on the Gen 4 stuff, and without making any changes, got it into detonation, let's say, with too much timing or whatever we're doing, and then move the sensors and see if it changed the sensitivity. Your problem was solved and kept it as a rule of thumb. All right. I'm good with that. We got 2 more minutes. Would you run an intercooler on an E85 carbureted big block Chevy at 7 pounds? 64% saying yes. I'm actually kind of surprised about that. I thought it would be less than that. Ever run a temp gauge on each exhaust tube? You mean exhaust gas temperatures probes? We've run them on. We run EGTs on all 8 cylinders. We run O2 sensors on all 8 cylinders. Before I don't do it every time, but we have. My pop's car was shooting for the elusive 5-second quarter mile. We had the wrong cam and went down 100,000 on lifts. Car runs much better. Maxing out the 6.0 chassis, big block. How much lift did you have? Did you have like all of it? Did you have like 900 or something? You hear it hit VTEC now. You need to put an exhaust. An exhaust definitely makes it sound more VTEC-y, but also the air intake makes a big difference too. Any spark plug dyno testing? Yeah, there's like 3 or 4 videos up on spark plug dyno testing. I already did plug gap and plug indexing and different types of plugs and plug temperatures and all kinds of stuff. I worked diesel shop and had a 12-cylinder 2-stroke Detroit on the dyno. that is very cool. Was it a turbo and supercharged 2-stroke diesel? John, lots of guys running that at 1,000 horsepower. I'm assuming you're talking about drag racing. Yeah, because an L59, that's like an LM7. Running methanol and 2 intercoolers on my compound boosted LSJ. It never gets above 100. That's good. Turbos and blowers. Oh my. Screaming Jimmy 2-stroke diesels. Yeah, a stock block. Like we made 100 runs on the LM7 at 1,000 horsepower. So if your tune is right, you're not going to hurt it. You could go drag race it at that number. A lot of guys do that. The block's not going to get hurt. The rod or piston would get hurt before that. Richard just got a 250,000 mile 5.3. Goods just broken in. Very dirty inside. Planning on budget GT45. Should I clean inside? Should I surface the deck? Very budget, but want reliable. Surfacing is pricing and long wait. Does it run now? If it runs now, I wouldn't worry about it. Dewey, you're an hour late. That's right. And only 1 minute left. That's time to go. What are you doing, Bruno? What's up? And on that note, it's time to go feed Bruno. I hope you guys all have a good night. I'm working on another video on the Trinity intake manifold versus the low ram. So shootout of 2 ultra short ram intake manifolds. See how they do together. And then I've got some Hemi stuff coming up also. But I will see you guys all tomorrow.